Clapper board. You're about to hear an original Hfy sci-fi tale titled, "The Alien Girl Was Terrified When She Learned How Humans Reproduce." Hfy sci-fi story. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. It began with a whisper inside a dying ship and the sound of small things breaking. Bulkheads groaned like old bones under strain. Lights flickered and steadied and flickered again, dimming the corridor to a twilight of sparking fiber and drifting smoke. The UNS Pilgrim's Resolve coasted in a slow tumble over the gray husk of an irradiated moon, its navigational thrusters coughing pale fire. Beyond the starboard viewport, no window anymore but a wound stitched in armored glass. The wreckage of two fleets floated in a silent necklace around the world they had tried to conquer. There were torn hulls, cooked plating, antennae blown to hair-thin spines. There were things shaped like spears and things shaped like sickles. There were the bodies of the lost, tethered to nothing, hands open. Captain Ree Morgan moved through the smoke with a limp that came and went with the pain. Her suit was scorched beige-gray, patch-glossed at both knees and right elbow. She had shaved her hair in the medbay after the plasma fires, a quick practical move, so her skull shone under the flicker mapped in old scars that made her look older than 40. The patch that mattered on her sleeve wasn't her name, it was the black threadwork stitched beneath it. Pilgrim's Resolve, a small ship with a big promise. She reached the salvage cradle, braced her shoulders against the frame, and peered inside. The pod they had reeled in from the debris looked like a seed carved from amphibolite and glass. It hummed with a low, soprano vibration, the kind that made your chest feel hungry for air. A faint bluish mist gathered at its seams. Through the translucent oval of its lid, she saw the narrow, starlit face of a young alien woman, barely more than a girl by human measure. Luminous skin the color of the inside of an oyster. Veins that looked like fine silver writing. No armor, no visible weapons. The pod system readouts, wildly alien in glyph and color, pulsed in a frantic cadence, like a heart that had forgotten its beat. "Got her," Chief Engineer Imani called from the gantry above. "Got her," Ree said. "She's enemy," said Sergeant Korik, appearing out of the haze with a cannon hanging low in his hands. He was bleeding from a slice across the cheekbone, and he wore a grin that looked stapled there to keep his jaw from shaking. "Or she was 5 hours ago." "Then she's a prisoner now," Ree answered, and when Korik's grin hardened, she added gently, "and a patient." Orders from Fleet were clear about Xathen survivors. Korik said not to challenge but to put the words in the air so they could become something else. No retrieval, no quarter. Orders were clear before the gate collapsed and no one picked up the other half of our calls, Ree said, placing a palm against the pod's cool lid. Under the glass, the alien's breath fogged, thin and quick. Ree could see the panic there, trapped like a moth. "Open it." Korik hesitated. Imani leaned over the rail, eyes glinting. "Captain," Ree's thumb found the emergency override. Human systems didn't speak Xathen, but engineers were engineers across the galaxy. There was usually a lever, usually a universal logic to the fail-safe. The pod thrummed in a pain song. Ree pressed hard. A seam unsealed with a whisper like held breath finally let go. Cold air burst out. It smelled like winter stone and crushed mint. The alien opened her eyes. They were vast and mercurial, silver around vertical pupils like pin drops of midnight. She saw Ree. She saw the ceiling. She saw the smoke. Then she flinched with a sound like wind chimes struck by a sharp wind, scrambling back until the pod's decking stopped her. She raised both hands, the fingers long and translucent, and curled them in a gesture anyone could understand, a plea, a fragile defense. "Hey," Ree said softly in that voice she used on green ensigns who just heard their first incoming scream. "You're aboard a human ship, you're safe, breathe slow." The alien's gaze tracked Rhee's mouth, trying to match the shapes to meaning. A beat, then another. She whispered a word that touched the air and rearranged it. Xathen, said the ship's linguistics filter in Rhee's ear, mapping sound to pattern. Her name is Xathen. Xathen said another word, trembling. The filter lagged. Don't let the dark take me. It won't, Rhee said, not sure if that was a promise she had a right to make. You're with us now. Us, Xathen repeated, uncertain. The word tasted strange to her. Korik let out a low breath. We're going to catch hell for this, Captain. Rhee kept her eyes on Xathen and said, We're already in hell, Sergeant. Might as well bring someone out with us. They carried the pod to medbay on a stretcher sled because the ship's gurneys had all melted into puddles of sorrow 2 decks down. The medbay was a clean wound inside a dirty ship, consoles blinking in steadfast patience, the air thin but sterile. Dr. Hfy, who could tie off a ruptured artery with one hand while using the other to hold a terrified sailor's face and keep them here, touched the alien's wrist lightly and looked up. Pulse is wrong but consistent, Hfy said. Respiration shallow, no trauma that I can read, biochemistry unknown, she's scared. Rhee nodded, so is everyone. The doctor's mouth tightened in that compassionate way real healers learn. They make a private room inside their face for sorrow and don't let it leak out. I'll keep her breathing, Captain. Keep her safe, Rhee said. If anyone objects, tell them to object to me. They already do, Hfy said, and something like real humor slipped through. Rhee stayed beside Xathen's bed long after everyone else went to rebuild the parts of the ship that had tried to die. She watched the alien's chest move in a fragile tide. The silver in Xathen's veins fluttered with each heartbeat. It made her look carved of river and star. When Xathen woke again, she turned her face to Rhee with careful motions, like a deer learning the path of a hunter's eyes. You speak, Xathen whispered, and the filter supplied a human shape. Your mouth makes thunder sounds, but there is sense inside them. Sense and thunder, Rhee said. It's a human specialty. She let the corner of her mouth lift. I'm Rhee. The alien tried the syllable, softened it, nearly sang it. You saved me. Rhee's eyes flicked to the floor, then back. We don't leave people to the cold if we can help it. Xathen blinked slowly. But we were killing you. You were killing us. Your ships tore my fleet. You burn. You do not stop when burned. We were all killing, Rhee said. And now we are stopping, at least in this room. The alien's throat worked. She glanced at the curtained alcoves on either side where human bodies lay in the hush of machines. She listened, Rhee could tell, to the bass chords of hurt that a ship can't hide, the distant moan of steel, the cough in the ventilation, the stupid bravery in a laugh 3 compartments over. You are many kinds, Xathen whispered. I have seen pictures of you. Your faces differ, your colors differ, your sizes, your songs. Songs differ, Rhee agreed. Hearts rhyme. The alien touched the med blanket as if the fabric might tell her a truth. We thought that was a lie. What? That there could be unity in difference, Xathen said. That disorder might breed strength. Our elders said you were a cautionary story, a species not yet harmonized to itself. They laughed when they said your children are born with chance. With chance, Rhee said, tasting the alien's fear now the way a thunderhead tastes of metal. Yes, Xathen's fingers trembled. You mix at random, you bond not by design but by impulse. No lattice, no vault, no encoded line to guarantee the child will match a permitted form. No vault, Rhee said. No permission. She held Xathen's gaze because she could feel the shaking under the alien's words. We carry the future inside fragile flesh and make promises we hope we can keep. Xathen's lips parted in a small, horrified O. You risk your species in small rooms, in blood, in pain, without the masters of form to correct the drift. She swallowed. We were told this. I never believed the story. It sounded like a nightmare told to make younglings cling to the vaults. Fear's a kind of story, Rhee said. Sometimes it's even true. We are a nightmare to those who need control to breathe. But how do you survive? Xathen's voice was just a thread. Your young could be malformed, your lines could tangle, disease could run like flame. Without cast songs to map the perfect child, how did you? By failing, Rhys said quietly. By grieving, by trying again. By being too damn stubborn to lie down and let the cold write our ending. She paused, and by loving the little chance that becomes a person more than the perfect plan that could have kept us sterile and safe. The alien lay still. Her eyes shone with a gathering wet. That is terrifying. Most beautiful things are, Rhys said, and for a while they listened to the ship breathe for both of them. The Pilgrim's resolve limped toward the fallback gate with her belly full of luck and her spine a ladder of fastened patch plates. The engineers slept in rotations too short to dream. The cooks boiled coffee in dented pots and poured it into chipped mugs and called it breakfast, lunch, dinner, and sacrament. Children of Earth had carried less home from worse, Rhys told herself, and believed it because faith is a muscle that grows under load. On the second watch after rescue, Xathen asked for stories. Not about war, she said, lowering her eyes as if apology could soften terror. We have learned enough songs about how things end. Tell me how you begin. Rhys thought of hospital rooms painted with starlight. Of a scream that breaks a woman and puts her back together with someone else's heartbeat inside hers forever. Of warm towels. Of a nurse's steady hands. Of a lover who can't stop laughing and crying because both are the body's way of saying yes to the impossible. She did not tell Xathen details. There's a kindness in leaving some doors closed to strangers. But she spoke about humans like a map of rivers, about blood that learned to carry iron, about bones that discovered leverage, about lungs that decided a blue world was worth breathing even if breathing meant drowning sometimes first, when you're new and scared and the air hurts and you cry because you have learned loss in the same heartbeat as you learned light. Xathen listened with that stillness only the very young and very old can manage. And you die often, so often. Your mothers risk themselves. Sometimes, Rhys said, the word heavier than the one syllable could carry. We have medicines, we have skill, we have luck, but sometimes the cost of making more life is paid in the coin of life. Xathen flinched. Our vaults would never allow that. Your vaults took your choices, Rhys said gently. Someone decided terror was a fair trade for symmetry. Xathen turned away. When she spoke again, her voice carried the soft clink of broken faith. I thought we were free because we did not fear disease. I begin to suspect the disease was our certainty. On the fourth day, the ship's long-range antenna finally coughed up enough power to throw a signal past the broken relay chain. A reply came back that looked like a hand over a candle. Shaky, but warm. Sol was alive. Earth was still blue. The gate at Neptune was open. There was a berth waiting. There was also a war council that wanted Rhys Morgan's head for disobeying the letter of Directive 9C regarding Xathen survivors. Reread the line twice and then a third time. She poured coffee in the medbay, sat on the floor and passed Xathen a cup because the ritual mattered more than the beverage. What is this? Xathen asked, sniffing with wary reverence. Coffee smelled like bark and burnt stars. A hug you can drink, Rhys said. Xathen sipped and nearly trembled out of herself. It is bitter. It is honest, Rhys said. The Pilgrim's resolve arrived in Sol on a dawn that didn't belong to any clock. It belonged to the human heart. The gate's ring turned like a patient Titan brushing dust from its shoulders. Jupiter loomed like a bruised god, Sancho Panza to a sun that refused to admit it was a windmill. The traffic lanes flickered with the soft logic of lives going to work, going to school, going to check on a grandmother who didn't answer her vid call the first time. Earth wore its clouds like forgiving thoughts. They put down at New Geneva, where glass had melted and been poured again into towers that knew they could break and didn't hold it against the wind. Xathen stepped off the ramp and drew in a trembling breath. It smelled like rain and ocean and electric promise and frying onions from a cart 3 streets over. Every face was different. Every voice wore a different gravity. There were hands rough with rope and hands soft from keyboard calluses and hands missing 2 fingers and hands painted with little flowers in colors Vanny didn't have a word for. Someone on a balcony played a violin like it was telling the sky a secret it would never keep. "How do you not explode?" Vanny asked, eyes wide. "There is too much. Too many stories arranged too close together." "We do explode," Rhys said with weary affection. "Then we sweep up the pieces and make mosaics." In the days after arrival, Vanny lived under more cameras than starlight. A Xathen living on Earth was a headline even when most people were too tired or too decent to go hunting for blood. The Science Corps invited her to a briefing and fed her, like all good scientists do, with an unholy combination of hospitality and curiosity. Vanny spoke about Xathen genetic harmonics and runic code and the beauty of a healthy vault, the kindness in a song you never had to fear would go wrong. Then she spoke about the first time she'd seen a human child in New Geneva, a baby in a sling against a mother's chest, hair a black curl the size of a question mark, cheeks like ripe moons. The mother's hand had patted the baby's back with a rhythm older than language. Another mother, skin lighter, hair red, had leaned over and said something that made them both laugh. The babies had made baby noises, that universal consonant of life. Vanny had stood very still and realized her fear and longing were the same shape. "And what do you conclude?" asked Dr. Salim, who built vaccines and arguments with equal precision. "That your species chose to live in risk because you believed the song would be sweeter if everyone could sing their own note," Vanny said. She surprised herself with the steadiness of her voice. "And that my people chose safety so hard we forgot how to listen. There were those who quietly put down their pens because sometimes the data you needed to write was waiting inside your chest. There were those who shouted because fear hates to go quiet. The feeds called Vanny many names: traitor, saint, experiment, proof. Extremists from both species posted threats shaped like dead birds." Rhys sat with her at a small table in a small apartment with a view of the lake, and taught her how to ignore some noises and answer others. "You do realize," Rhys said, buttering bread like she'd been taught by a grandmother in a kitchen that no longer existed, that a lot of people in high places want you to go back to a lab and stay a specimen. Vanny took the slice as if it were a ritual and not food. "If I am a bridge, I cannot be placed in a museum. You'll be a target," Rhys said. "Then I will learn to be a smaller target," Vanny said, and Rhys smiled like a knife hiding in velvet. Returned to duty, Earth heals but never idles. Vanny began to teach in careful rooms with careful windows and careful guards. It turned out that a girl raised in people's fear could be trusted to hold other people's fear and not crush it. She did not evangelize. She described. She listened. She compared. She asked whether the vaults could learn to admit a little chance without losing their purpose, and whether humans could share a little safety without misremembering who they are. And she went walking when the days got heavy, because the streets of New Geneva had a way of washing you. There was a seamstress named Amaya who measured clothes in quiet jokes. There was a fruit seller who always put an extra plum in Vanny's bag because the seller's grandmother had told her long ago, "Feed the traveler. Tomorrow they could be you." There was a boy with a wheelchair who raced delivery drones for pocket creds and called Vanny Star Girl because she glowed in the dark without even meaning to. One rainy evening, Vanny turned a corner into a small plaza where a statue of a woman stood with a torch that wasn't on fire and didn't need to be. The plaque read, "For the builders." Under the awning of a ramen stand, a young couple huddled in a pocket of warmth. The woman was round with pregnancy. Her face caught rain and turned it into a smile that lit the wet evening. The man's hand was on her belly. He was saying something, voice low, older than language. The woman laughed. Vanny felt the axis of her heart tilt. It wasn't the swell of the belly that shook her. She had seen that before now. It was the faith. The raw, audacious gamble of it, that two fragile humans would look at a world that had tried to burn itself down 3 times in 1 generation and say, yes, more. That they would stand under a storm and hold a future with such tenderness it could almost survive the holding. A man in a cheap jacket with rage stitched into his shoulders came up behind Xathen then, muttered hate math about aliens and jobs and oh-so-holy bloodlines, and shoved her hard enough that the world jumped. He was arrested before his second shove. A street camera had eyes that cared. The pregnant woman swore beautifully. The man beside her offered Xathen a hand up. You okay? Xathen tasted blood on her lip and rain on her tongue. I will be, she said. She wanted absurdly to bless them. Instead she said, your child, they will be perfect. The woman laughed then, genuine and loud and exactly right. Oh honey, she said, wiping water off her cheeks, they'll be themselves. That's more than perfect. When Xathen lay in her narrow bed that night, she thought about the vaults, how sterile they had smelled, like cold glass that thought too highly of itself. She thought about symmetry as a god, and how gods sometimes need to be dethroned for life to breathe. She thought about the terror of the human way, and realized with a shock that it had become her hope. Reread the security reports and seethed without outward flame. She met with Fleet in rooms where the windows were big enough to remind admirals that someone outside the glass might be living. You want a symbol, she said flatly. Xathen was never that. She is a person. If you treat her like a flag, you will wrap her around a pole and leave her to the weather and then pretend the weather was the sin. Admiral, said Counselor Neum, tired, decent, and very good at math with lives. The Saul Gate picked up movement 2 days ago. A Xathen hardliner fleet under Admiral Coral broke from their own chain and is burning fast for our lines. They want to prove the peace faction weak. They want to pull their people back under the vaults by showing them monsters. Then don't let them find any, Rhys said. Even in us. When Coral's spear hit the one place every human in Saul would die to defend, there were no gentle options left. The first wave slammed into the Neptune Gate on a Tuesday like any other, which is to say there were school lunches packed, and 1,000 tired fathers on night shift and one grandmother in Lagos who woke at 3 a.m. and didn't know why and prayed for a girl she'd never meet. The gate's defense grid woke like a lion mid-dream, bewildered, angry, already clawing. Rhee's voice went out over 1,000,000 channels. She said, hold and push and no further, and I have you, and I will not waste you, and she might as well have said a psalm. Xathen watched from a tower in New Geneva with a roomful of civilians who had never asked to be brave and were about to be so anyway. The sky was blue. The feeds made it look like a board game. She had seen real space, and knew that what looked like light was the last thing thousands would see. In the opening minutes, 4 human destroyers cut a path through a wedge of Xathen glass lances, with the kind of violence that later you pretend was clean. 2 enemy carriers folded like paper, and inside each were pilots who had learned to fly for the honor of vault harmonies and never learned how to crash in a way their mothers could forgive. Rhee took the pilgrims' resolve to the front because leaders belong in the stories they ask others to live. Her helm was a piano's worth of levers and light. Her palms knew each by touch. She had learned this ship like a second language and loved it like a first. Coral, she said into the quiet channel she hoped the enemy would answer. Turn back. Your quarrel is with the part of yourself that fears you were wrong. Do not make children pay for your certainty. Coral answered with a weapon nobody outside the vaults had known existed. It came across the gap as a shell the size of a building and unfolded into a song. Not metaphorical. A literal wave pattern shaped to tear harmonies out of lattice and bone. The first human cruiser it touched came apart with the tragic elegance of frost forming on glass and instantly cracking. The second went blind. All her systems forgot their names. The third managed to limp behind a refinery rock and play dead, which is a kind of mercy you teach yourself on the run. Xathen felt the song as a pressure behind her eyes. She whispered no in her first language and no again in the human one. "That is a vault breaker." She told the room of civilians, and they asked, "What is a vault breaker?" And she said, "Our worst prayer." For a moment, New Geneva wasn't a city. It was a mouth shaped around grief. Ree learned the weapon by dying near it. She lost 2 engines and found a friend's last words in the crackle of static. She saw the pattern in the shimmer because soldiers who live long enough learn to see the shape of teeth behind the bite. She ordered a repositioning that defied half her training and all her good sense. The fleet pivoted not away from pain but through it, using the gates ring itself as a shield, the way you use a tree to catch a bear's charge and slip aside. It didn't save everyone. It saved enough. On Earth, Xathen ran. She ran out of the tower and down stone stairs and across a square where a child stared at a puddle like it held the future, and maybe it did. She ran into the Science Corps building and into the lab where she had been an exhibit and a teacher and a cautionary tale. She grabbed chalk. She grabbed code. She wrote the wave shape on a wall and then inverted it and then stitched it into a human algorithm like she was weaving 2 dialects into a single lullaby. "What is that?" Dr. Salim said at her shoulder, breathless, refusing to be left behind. "A song we can hum back," Xathen said. "Not to kill, to tangle. You're going to break their weapon with noise." "I'm going to teach it to doubt itself," Xathen said and shoved the file to orbital. In the crush of battle, Ree's comm pinged in that bright tone that means salvation might be in the packet or might be a joke God plays on you. She opened the file. She saw a wave become another wave and cancel out its own spine. She did the math in her bones and it came up gold. "Play it," she told her signal tech. "You don't have the right resonant membranes. We're steel and stubbornness, not choirs." "Then pretend," Ree said. "Half of war is pretending until the universe believes you." They played Xathen's counter song through broken plates and warped antennae and the teeth of the gate. It sounded wrong and then less wrong and then strangely beautiful. The next time Coral fired, the wave hit the counterwave and the 2 went through each other and came out the other side tired. Ree, sensing breath, ordered the push she had been waiting for since her first day wearing a uniform. "All ships, line abreast, close to grappling distance. We are not ghosts. We are not math. We are not correct. We are here." The Pilgrim's resolve took the point. She always did. In the streets of New Geneva, sirens were thoughts people shared. In a basement that had once stored winter potatoes and now stored hope, Xathen found herself holding the hand of a woman whose husband was on a tug that had no right to be in a battle and was anyway. The woman's other hand held a toddler with braids and a temper. The toddler said, "When is Daddy home?" And Xathen said, "After the big wave." The toddler nodded. This sounded like bedtime. Coral, who had never lost a game of anything in his entire curated life, threw his second-tier fleet into the human wall with the fury of a perfectionist seeing a smudge on his mirror. Ree took the impact and bent but did not break. 3 of her ships did. The names of those ships would be threads in a tapestry strangers touched later to feel warmth. Ree had 1 card left and hated it. She looked at her crew, Imani with grease up to both elbows, Korik with a grin too brave to be honest, the kid at comms whose hands shook when they weren't on the board and stilled when they were. "We're going to ram the carrier," she said, and no one looked surprised. They had known. The carrier was a palace in armor, the kind of fortress you build around a fear you will not name. It spat drones. It sang the vault's song. It believed itself invincible because no one had taught it doubt. Re-angled the Pilgrim's nose at the place where the carrier's power grid fed its posture, and said into the quiet channel, "Coral, my mother taught me to knock." Coral answered with a scoff that would have been a sob if he had been allowed to be born imperfect. The ramming wasn't neat. It was blood and torn plating and a spray of glitter that had names once. The Resolve's prow buried itself like a seed in a crack in winter. The carrier's lights stuttered and went out sector by sector as if embarrassed. The counter-song hummed. The vault breaker folded up its edges and went home to think. "Get out," Ree told her crew, which is what captains say when the price needs paying and they are the coin. That is an order. Imani swore and obeyed. Korik grinned and obeyed. The kid at comms whispered, "Thank you," and obeyed. Hfy's voice came up from medbay, steady as always, and said, "I'm bringing my patience," which was the first and last time she disobeyed Ree, and no one marked it against her because Mercy's paperwork is written elsewhere. Ree stayed. She rested her hands on the console. She thought of small rooms. She thought of risk shaped like love. She thought of a young alien woman watching a pregnant human laugh in the rain and finding hope where she had been taught to find horror. She thought of mosaics. She drove the ship deeper. On Earth, the feeds went white, and a noise rose from a billion throats that was neither grief nor celebration but a chord between them. The explosion wasn't cinematic. It was practical. It made a hole where there needed to be one. It redirected a wave by removing a mouth that would have blown it wider. In distant basements, in towers, in kitchens, in a wheelchair at the edge of a plaza, people felt something loosen in their chests they had not dared to hold. A future. When the light cleared, the gate still stood. The enemy fleet, lighterless and suddenly unsure, withdrew in a line that looked too neat to belong to a living thing. The human formation didn't chase. Sometimes victory is knowing which hungers not to feed. Xathen didn't cry until she saw Ree's name on the first roll of the dead, not because she believed Ree immortal, but because the human heart is a muscle that will hold anything you ask of it until you tell it the holding is over. She went to the memorial garden at New Geneva where screens hung like lanterns in a soft forest of metal and showed faces that looked embarrassed to be holy. She put her hand against Ree's name. Her palm glowed faintly, flushing silver. "You once told me that terror and beauty share a door," she whispered. "You taught me how to knock." She wanted to say more, but there are words you must speak with your life or not at all. In the weeks after, Earth went about the business humans always return to after battles. Sweeping, tallying, making lists, making casseroles, telling jokes that shouldn't be funny and are because they insist on joy. Fleets repositioned like shoulders setting after a blow. Letters went out that started with "We regret to inform you" and ended with "We are forever grateful." New Geneva turned down its sirens and turned up its street music. A woman went into labor in a shelter with a mural of stars on the ceiling and gave birth to a child with a tuft of hair the color of walnuts. Someone told a joke that made the new mother laugh between pains, and for a moment the world had room for nothing but her breath and the sound of a small life insisting. Xathen didn't go back to the labs full time. She divided her days between rooms where equations were the truest language and rooms where you had to look people in the eye to make sense. She answered questions from students who would one day launch ships with hands steadier than hers. She spoke with Xathen diplomats, voices rough with guilt and pride, and asked them whether their vaults could be convened around care rather than control. A few listened the way dry ground listens to rain. There were still threats. A man with hot fear in his blood threw paint against her door and ran. A woman with cool fear in her voice wrote a letter asking her kindly to leave the planet forever. Xathen saved the letter and read it sometimes as a reminder that hatred often wears the clothes of politeness. The fruit seller still put an extra plum in her bag. In a classroom one winter morning, a child raised a hand and asked, "If humans sometimes break, why do they keep making more humans?" The teacher, flustered, looked at Xathen. Xathen said, "Because each new one is a promise that the breaking isn't the last thing." The class went quiet with the peculiar hush children make when they feel an answer they'll remember. On a beach months later, New Geneva's narrow curve of engineered sand and concrete joy, Xathen walked at dusk while the lake pretended to be an ocean and did a good job of it. People were building things because that is what people do with hands. A fish of sand, a tower that would fall, a trench that would fill with water and be a river for precisely 30 minutes. From a cluster of towels came a little cry. A mother, tired and fierce, lifted a newborn up into the glow from the city, and the child's first breath hit air and became a sound such as the universe invents to remind itself there is more than fire. Xathen remembered the first time Rhi had said chance like it was a blessing. She remembered the fear that had closed her throat, the sense that humans must be mad to risk so much in such small rooms. She watched a man kiss the woman's temple. She watched a child of 4 lean over and peer at the baby as if she had discovered a new star. She watched the mother choose to be afraid and brave at once and accept that both could live in her chest. She felt something inside herself take root the way a seed does when you are not looking, and then when you are, it is already a leaf. An old man with a navy cap sat on a bench watching the water forget each wave and begin another. He patted the seat beside him. Xathen sat. He said, "You glow in the evening, young lady," and she said, "So do you," and he laughed and coughed and laughed again. His hands were scar-mapped. He said, "I lost 3 good friends at Neptune, not to make her sad, but to place their names in the air again where the world could hold them." He told a story about a tin of peaches in syrup passed down a line of engineers because sugar is morale, and the can opener was in the wrong compartment, and they used a welding torch instead. Xathen told a story about a vault keeper who had broken the rules once to save a child and had been forgiven only after he died. The old man shook his head with sorrow and said, "Let's do our forgiving now." When Xathen rose to go, the old man said without looking at her, "You brought us a song when we were being unmade by one. Thank you." She did not cry then either. She walked into the violet and the city became stars. The Xathen hardliners fractured in the wake of their weapons' failure. Some dug deeper trenches inside their dogma. Some came out blinking and asked if there might be another way to be safe, a way that didn't begin by breaking everyone else. Months of talks bled into years. The war thawed into a tense peace that wasn't a ribbon to be cut at a podium, but a practice to be polished every day like a mirror you hope will show you who you are becoming. Xathen returned once, escorted and armored in diplomacy, to a Xathen world so sterilized it squeaked when you turned your head. The vault keepers met her in a hall that felt like the inside of a crystal that had never known dirt. She stood under a ceiling that bent light into obedience and said gently, "You taught me we can sing together without being the same note. I learned a different harmony on earth. I offer it." One keeper, a woman with eyes like polished mercury and a sorrow that had crept in under her doors despite all effort, asked, "Are you happy there?" Xathen thought of markets and rain and small rooms where songs begin. "I am learning," she said. "Humans call that kind of happiness. Would you return to the vaults? We can undo your drift." "I am not a mistake to be corrected," Xathen answered. "I am a person to be met." Not everyone in the room winced. It was enough. Years later, enough years for grief's sharp edge to get its coat on and leave by the back door. Enough years for babies to become toddlers and point at ships and say mine. There was a ceremony at the New Geneva waterfront to rechristen a rebuilt frigate. The name on her prow was cut from an old hull and polished until it reflected faces, Pilgrim's Resolve. A woman in a simple black uniform with hair the color of steel in summer, the new captain, spoke about duty and the weight of the dead on the living, and the joy of carrying that weight with friends. She read a letter from an engineer who'd been 19 at Neptune and was 40 now and still could make a pump sing a lullaby. The crowd cheered like they were clapping the air back together after a long separation. Xathen stood at the edge, hands in the pockets of a jacket a tailor had made for her that fit like agreement. She touched the dent in the metal where the old ship had saved 1,000 lives by giving up its own. A child in a stroller reached out and patted her glowing hand with solemn approval. Xathen laughed softly and turned to the woman beside her. It was the pregnant woman from that rainy night, not pregnant now, hair longer, eyes real. The man was there too, carrying a backpack full of snacks and hopes. The child was theirs. She grinned up at Xathen and said, "Star Girl, because some names are better than the ones you are given." "Hello," Xathen said, and meant it the way you mean a prayer you are not sure who is hearing. "You were right," the woman said. "About what?" "Perfect would have been boring," she said, and the little girl nodded as if she'd always known. Later, when the speeches were over and the ship slid out with the shy swagger of the newly named, Xathen went to the memorial garden again. Rhee's name shone steady. Xathen sat on the warm stone and told her what had happened since, because the dead deserve updates. She spoke about the vault keepers who were experimenting with choice chambers, where a pair could propose their own song to the vault, and the vault would say yes if it heard love in the math. She spoke about a human boy who built a prosthetic hand for his grandmother out of recycled drone parts in gratitude. She spoke about the counter song, and how human choirs now practiced it alongside old anthems, not because they were afraid, but because they refused to be caught unready again. She did not realize she had been speaking aloud until a shadow crossed the stone. A teenager stood there, hair in their eyes, jacket patched. "Is that your mother?" they asked, pointing to Rhee's name. "She is someone who mothered me," Xathen said, and the teenager nodded as if this made more sense than any bloodline. The sky above New Geneva softened into that color you can only call forgiveness if you have earned it. A drone traced a heart by accident. Someone dropped a stack of plates in a restaurant and everyone clapped. Back at her apartment, Xathen opened her window to let in the city's hum. She kept no plants. Light alone kept her well. On a shelf was the tin cup she'd first sipped coffee from, a gift from Hfy with a note. "There are other medicines." In a drawer she kept the first toy the fruit seller's daughter had knitted for her, a small lump meant to be a star that looked more like a potato and was therefore perfect. She lay down. She breathed the way humans had taught her, in, out, as if the air were a friend you were walking with and you did not need to match steps, but you did anyway because it felt kind. She thought about fear and its cousins and the way they sit at the table until you ask them to help clean up and then they find they have hands. She thought about chance and how humans held it like a candle against the wind, knowing it could gutter, choosing to shelter it anyway. She slept without nightmare. In the morning, a message waited from a vault keeper who had been a child when the war began. It said, "We are listening. Teach us how to let our children surprise us." Xathen wrote back, "Begin by making room for surprise in your own day. Eat without a schedule. Ask a question with no intended answer. Stand in the rain without your hood." They laughed in the next exchange, baffled, and she smiled into her tea. On a small farm outside New Geneva, the kind built with clever soil and careful water, a woman knelt in a furrow and planted seedlings that would feed a city block. Her partner stood nearby with a tablet and a puzzled look he didn't bother hiding. "They're saying the Xathen are opening something called a garden vault that uses human randomization algorithms to add small, controlled drift to the gene songs." "Good," the woman said. "They'll find out their children have jokes no one wrote for them." "Is that safe?" "No," she said, "it's life." In the orbital shipyards, welders wrote their names in places only other welders would see and signed them like love letters to the future. "To whoever fights in the steel after me, I left you a superstition and some hope. Use both." They whistled the counter song without thinking. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a reminder that songs can be undone and remade. In a vault deep within a Xathen city, two younglings stood in a chamber whose walls were not smooth for the first time in 1,000 years. There were small imperfections pressed there by design, thumbprints, textures, places where light pretended not to know what to do and then figured it out. They reached, touched, giggled, pulled away as if burned, touched again. A keeper watched with a heart that hurt and healed and hurt in a new way that felt like a door, opening onto a balcony that looked out onto the kind of view that could teach you humility. And at the edge of a lake that liked to be an ocean, in a city that had learned how to be broken and not be undone, Xathen walked at dusk with a small girl whose parents had once laughed in the rain. The girl held Xathen's hand and pointed at the sky. "That one," she said, selecting a star gravitationally bound to an old story. "Is that where you're from?" "No," Xathen said, "but we can pretend for tonight." "Okay," the girl said, "we can give it a name." "What name?" the girl considered with the solemnity of the very young while a drone pestered a gull and lost. "Home," she decided. Xathen looked up at a point of light older than the idea of vaults. She thought of rooms where brave people had stepped into risk and called it love. She thought of Ree Morgan smiling like velvet hiding steel. She thought of a human future not guaranteed by perfection but built daily by hands that failed and tried again. She squeezed the girl's hand. "Home," she said, and the star, unoffended, kept shining. The city around them pulsed. The ships above them moved like thoughts. Somewhere, a woman told a man a joke that saved his life for a day. Somewhere else, a mechanic found a crack before it became a fault, and a mother slept because of it. A vault keeper asked their apprentice what they feared most and listened, really listened, to the answer. An admiral signed a paper with a hand that shook and made a peace that would be revised and tested and shouted at and held. Humanity did not conquer the galaxy that year. It did something the galaxy had not expected and therefore did not know how to fight. It endured. It offered its terrifying, beautiful way of being to anyone who wanted to try it for a day and see if it fit. The way of chance held like a candle, of grief held like a name you say each morning to be sure you still can, of love held like a bridge you do not put in a museum because you are walking it. At the memorial garden the names glowed. At the waterfront, a ship sailed under its own willful weight. In a small apartment with a teacup cooling, Xathen stood by a window and listened to a planet breathe and found that the sound it made, messy, brave, off-key, harmonizing anyway, was the song she had always wanted and not known how to ask for. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic Hfy sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, sta.